Welcome. Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Barron Prawl. I am a project manager for the South Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or the MHTTC. I am very pleased to be your host for this webinar. I'm glad you're here. Today's presentation is titled Naming and Taming Overwhelm During the Pandemic and is facilitated by Sari Gilman, who is amazing. This event kicks off actually a series of workshops that Sari will be doing over the next 6 weeks. And I believe that the timing couldn't be better for the wisdom that she shares about well-being. So we are really glad that you're here to share this information together. Thank you all for joining us, and we truly hope that you find today's presentation engaging and helpful in your work. As I mentioned before this webcast here, and this is being sponsored by our South Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, you'll see here looking at this map that there are MHTTC regions all over the country. This particular event is being hosted by our South Southwest team, which is here located in this little purple section in Region 6. And the purpose of our MHTTC is really to develop and strengthen the specialized behavioral healthcare and primary healthcare workforce that provides mental health prevention, treatment, and recovery support services. And we do that through offering trainings like these, technical assistance, and the creation of products. Our goal really is to help people and organizations incorporate effective practices into mental health services. So after this presentation, please feel free to visit our website, and you can find your center where you're located, where you live, and you can sign up for trainings and resources also in the region. Just a quick brief disclaimer. This presentation was prepared for our MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement that we have from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA. So the opinions that are expressed in the presentation are the views of our speaker and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. Okay, now why don't we go ahead and get started? I am very pleased to introduce our presenter today. Sari Gilman is a licensed marriage and family therapist and author. She teaches overwhelm recovery for healthcare and human services providers. Sari is a prolific writer and has published 3 books. She's the author of The Mystery of Knowing Journal. It's a journal for self-care and boundaries. Transform Your Boundaries, and Naming and Taming Overwhelm for healthcare and human service providers. Sari ran nonprofit organizations for 20 years, and 2 of those organizations served children and teens who were homeless. Sari is the founder of Cocoon House in Everett, Washington State. She taught leadership development for 7 years, and she has been in practice for 35 years and continues to do so in her community in Whidbey Island in Washington. And I'll tell you what, Sari is pretty special, and we're very lucky to have her here today. And with that, I will turn the floor over to you, Sari.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. Gosh, what a generous start this is. And I'm so glad that you're all here with us, and I've got our PowerPoint up and we're ready to begin. I just want to share with you all that that this presentation this morning is based on a book that I did called Naming and Taming Overwhelm. And that book came out in 2017, so it was before the pandemic. And there's a lot in that book that is still very relevant to what we're all dealing with now. So I will be referencing some things from the book, but there are some things that are actually different. And there are specific things that we've all been experiencing in the pandemic that are not in the book, but are definitely going to be covered through this 6-session series that we're in. So, gosh, it's such a great thing to be here today. So here's a picture of where I live. I'm on Whidbey Island in Washington State. And I just want to go through a few guiding principles for today. I may have really different views than you have, and that is okay. You may have completely different views, and let's just respect the idea that all of us are coming to this with different perspectives, different experiences, and some similar experiences, but we may have different views. And if anybody asks a question and I start responding to that, I just ask that we respect confidentiality and when you ask questions, don't use any names of anybody. And we will be spending time doing some listening today, and feel free to open and close with yourself. This series is going to bring up a lot, and there might be moments in it that are hard for you. When I share stories, there might be moments that just make you feel very full. And so I just want you to allow yourself to just close internally, sit back from the computer if you need to. Don't feel any pressure to take any notes as we go. This is being recorded. Um, and just let whatever sticks with you stick with you. And so that process is just opening and closing as you need to. And if you need to walk away from the session, then allow yourself to do so. We've all been through a lot. Our agenda today is to understand the impact of widespread overwhelm, symptoms of overwhelm, and how to reduce overwhelm, and learn some key strategies that are going to be helpful during this time, and examine expectations, needs, vulnerability, and strengths, particularly in this session. And as I say that we're going to go through strategies, remember that we're going to go through strategies in each of the 6 sessions. So we're starting with a piece today, and we're going to be adding pieces as we go. Isn't that gorgeous, that tree turning all red there? Okay, so I would like to introduce myself to you. This is a self-portrait of me during the first few months of the pandemic. And I want to give you a brief snapshot of what I was experiencing in the early start of this pandemic. And I certainly want you later to think about where you were a year ago and what you were experiencing as the pandemic started. So there were 4 deaths in my private practice, and one was a child that was very ill that I had been visiting weekly with the mom and child in their home. And so the loss of that child went along with the start of this pandemic. And there was a lot of pain in my small community. I live in a community in a town that is literally 2 blocks long, and I've been practicing there for 35 years. And I know a lot of people in my town. I am working in 2nd and 3rd generation with some of the families that I worked with. And so there's a special relationship between me and my clients. And when they have a death in their family, I feel very touched by that. So there were 4 deaths. And I moved my 89-year-old mother-in-law into our home because we were worried about her getting COVID. And I have 3 grown daughters that are all healthcare practitioners in large facilities. So I was just very worried about them as well as everybody else in the general community. And I felt lopsided by this. And I felt when I did this portrait in an art class, I thought that's really me. That is exactly how I feel on the inside. So even though I write and teach on overwhelm and self-care, I felt very knocked sideways by this. And I want to share with you how I came to write and teach on overwhelm, just so that you have some grounding perspective of where this work came from. In 2008 and 2009, during our economic collapse, I noticed 2 things: that there were several losses all at once, very widespread in the community and across our country, and that in my little small private practice, there were very unusual rates of illness, and there was an onset of lots of chronic illness. And I was really concerned about that, because when you work and live in a very small town, you do notice when rates of illness dramatically increase. And I was calling physicians in the community and asking if, there was something going on. And of course, what I came to understand was really clarified by the work of Kate Strelly. She did this report in 2009 that put everything in perspective for me for 2008, which is when people lose a job and a business closes, there's an increase in the odds of poor health by 54% among workers who had no pre-existing health conditions. And it increases by 83% the odds of new health conditions being triggered. Now, this is all very relevant to us because the types of conditions that were stress related that people get when they lose their job are strokes, hypertension, heart disease, arthritis, diabetes, and emotional and psychiatric problems. So that puts tons more pressure on us as providers as these things are occurring in the community. So I was looking at that and I read that report, and it kind of put things in perspective of why I was seeing such an increase in illness. And I asked myself, well, is the overwhelm that I'm seeing in the community, is this unusual? Like it's a blip, we had an economic collapse, or is this going to be our new norm? And I really just held that question inside because having taught leadership development, having run organizations, I'm used to thinking like if you see something happen, what happens if you magnify it? That's just a way of thinking that helps when you're a leader or when you're teaching leaders. So I started magnifying this and I asked myself what would happen if we had widespread, sustained overwhelm hitting every sector of the community nationally and then globally. I didn't imagine a pandemic, though of course that makes sense. I just wondered what would happen and how would we manage this? And as I began to question, I started gathering information about what could help in a situation like that. And climate scientists actually reached out to me and asked me to start presenting my work. And that is how the Overwhelm work started going out on the road. And a foundation came to me and said they would co-publish a book with me on it to get the work out. So that's really the basis of how I started teaching Overwhelm work. And then chief medical officers from hospitals asked me to start working with them and share the work so that they could look at, how they could use it in a hospital setting. But now here we are in 2020. So that book came out in 2017. That was work that I had been looking at for about 9 years. And now I have some things that I'm adding to it. And so here you are. We are on the front lines of historical trauma, intergeneration trauma, racial trauma, institutional trauma, because our organizations aren't functioning very well through this, climate and environmental trauma, political trauma, national trauma, economic and pandemic trauma. There is incredible disruption and transformation taking place all around us. And the enormity of this, when I stand in front of this, the only thing I can say to you is that we find ourselves in front of something that is going to be lasting for decades. And we need to get our heads around this because when I was trained in mental health years and years ago, we thought about, and I was trained for, trauma and disasters. They have a beginning, a middle, and hopefully an end and a recovery time. But we didn't talk about the decades and decades and decades of work something like this would take. And when any one of these is going to be affecting us for a long time. So I say this because I want us to hold some big perspective of where you are, because this affects you very deeply in how we are going to go forward in this. And on top of all those things that we are facing collectively, there may be other big things just going on in your life, right? So many families have been dealing with just other issues. Maybe someone in your family has cancer. Maybe someone in your family was laid off. Maybe you're financially struggling. There might be someone in your very close quarters who's dealing with addiction. You might be dealing with addiction. So there's just additional layers going on top of all these layers. And I just want us to acknowledge the depth of this. And for the first time, we're all being called essential workers. And I thought, what an interesting word that is. We're now essential workers. I used to joke that if something really big happened, what good would I be? I'm a therapist. Like, would people, I'd just be like sitting on the corner and people would be like, what, talking to me? And I couldn't wrap my head around it. But it turns out, yeah, that's really actually very important during an event like this. And so here you all are. We're now essential workers, but you are essential workers carrying so many expectations on your shoulders right now, facing so many needs. And you are also vulnerable, very vulnerable, and you have strengths. And so we're going to explore that a little bit more in this session. And those keywords, expectations and needs, vulnerabilities and strengths. If you leave the session with one thing today, I just want you to carry those words around with you for a little while and let them unfold in you. That, because I'll be carrying those through all of our sessions together, and we'll be looking at how we apply that. So first, I just want to go over what is overwhelm and just share with you my working definition. So overwhelm is an attack, like a full-on attack on the mind, the body, and the spirit. It affects everything. And even though it's not a clinical diagnosis, I think it is, because when I hear people talk, and the word really struck me in 2008 because people kept saying, I'm overwhelmed, I'm so overwhelmed, I'm so overwhelmed. Now it's very commonplace as we've been a year in this pandemic. And I just want us to have a working definition. So when somebody tells me they're overwhelmed, I'm thinking about their mind, I'm thinking about their body, and I'm thinking about their spirit and how this is affecting all parts of them. And with overwhelm, you'll notice that when we're in a state of overwhelm, we have a lot of trouble with problem solving. And it's like we're trying to put together pieces of a puzzle, but we can't solve it because there's actually some pieces to the puzzle missing. But we're trying and trying and trying, but we don't have the pieces that we need in the puzzle to even put it together. But we often don't realize that. And that's a really important thing that comes up inside of overwhelm, because when we go to overwhelm recovery, we have to remember that we often may not have had the pieces to solve the puzzle that we've been working so hard to solve. And an essential part of working with overwhelm is being able to see yourself while you're caring for others, just being able to recognize yourself. When I saw that self-portrait that I did of myself, it was helpful. It was like looking in a mirror and really seeing myself and going, that is true. That is where I am. And in healthcare, we focus on others so much that many of us lose touch with where we are, continuously losing touch. And then we come back and we might find ourselves, but then once again, we go in and we lose touch with where we are. I love these words from Audre Lorde. She didn't mean them in this context, of course, because it was in the 70s when she wrote these words, and she was relating them to racial injustice. These words, though, are so important. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And I think those words are very true today. And so everything that we do to care for ourselves through the overwhelm, not just caring for others in the overwhelm, is an act of self-preservation. So take just, a moment, I want you to just write down with a pen and paper, or you can pop it into the chat. Just list a couple of your core values, maybe 3 of them, just the first 3 that come to your head. Don't overthink this. Core values that you hold. And one of the things that I want you to be able to do is look at how your core values can support you in these times. So when I did this activity, the first core value that I wrote down was being present with others. That's a really important value of mine, is being present. And so I turned that core value around. And when I turned it around, I said, how can I also offer this core value to myself? Being present with me. And that's what I want you to do with some of your core values. I want you to just ask yourself if there's something in your core values that can be turned around and offer it to yourself, just like food. And can you use that to help you in these times? And so turning around and being able to say, I will continue to be very present with others, and I will also offer presence to myself. Really important each day. So I just want you to see if there's some way that your core values can offer something to you. Another thing that's very helpful with overwhelm is just knowing where you are in the overwhelm zone. And so there aren't always times when you're in overwhelm, but there are times when you might be feeling very safe. So I want you to think of it as 3 rings in this circle. So there are times, maybe even during a day, where you're feeling very safe. There might be times when you're feeling challenged. And then there might be times when you're feeling overwhelmed. And you'll notice, like maybe you didn't feel overwhelmed at all for 3 or 4 days or a whole week. Or maybe you're feeling overwhelmed peaks and points all through the day. And then there are times when you come back out and you feel safe. So I want you to just use that so that that part of being present with yourself, you are also aware when you are overwhelmed and aware when you are just feeling safe and challenged. I went and I was visiting with one of my daughters, and I was walking with her by her neighborhood, and we saw this poster, and it was a poster for Black Lives Matter, and it had some writing on the poster, and it just made me cry. And I'm standing with her on the street corner looking at this poster, and tears are just rolling down my face. And that can happen. I realized I was overwhelmed and I was just at the edge of teariness, and it was okay to feel that. But I also realized this is my daughter who's in healthcare and is also dealing with patients all the time. And I think when I go and see her, I don't want to be crying right now in front of her. I want to be able to offer her a little more. So now, before I go visit any of my kids, I really check in with myself and I say, how close to that overwhelm zone am I? How teary am I? And I might give myself an extra day or 2 or even a week before I schedule seeing them so that I feel like I'm not quite in that zone, so that I'm not quite as vulnerable or fragile, so that I can offer a little bit more with them, because that's where I'd like to be. And so you can use that just to be able to check in with yourself and stay connected and know where you are. I don't want you to think of the overwhelm recovery process as this linear thing. I want you to think of it as circular. You return again and again to the overwhelm zone, particularly dealing with all the things that we're all dealing with. And you just have to know that you're there and do a few things, very simple things to help yourself. While the things that are overwhelming and the size and scope of what we're facing is actually very complicated, very dense, I promise you the things that help with overwhelm recovery are very simple. And I want you to take that message from today. They're not very complicated things. And you just have to be able to recognize. The hardest part is recognizing when you're in the overwhelm and being willing to throw yourself a little bit of a life ring and help pull yourself back out of that zone. If you leave yourself or abandon yourself or ignore yourself in that zone, recovery takes much longer. Recovery can take a year or 2 years. So I don't want you to ignore yourself in that zone. I want you to keep pulling yourself back out of the zone and offering yourself what you need so that you don't end up just stuck in that zone. So the very first step, and while I'm going to lay out a couple of steps to you, I also don't want you to be overwhelmed by the number of steps, because just do one of them, any one of them. If you do 2 or 3 of them, great. But I don't want you to feel like, oh my gosh, I have to do every one of these. I want you to figure out which ones you can offer yourself and when. And if you're only able to do one, that's still going to help you quite a bit. So the first step is being aware and responding to you. So that's that part of knowing where you are in those circles and asking yourself, what do I need? That is the key question, is asking, what do I need? And I ask myself that all through the day, even as simple things like, do I need a bathroom break? Do I need some water? Do I need to open the window and get a breath of fresh air? What do I need? That's all I want you to carry with you, that one question. The next step that also really helps is knowing when to open and when to close. So I ask myself that through the day, and closing means I am feeling at capacity inside emotionally, and I recognize when I'm at capacity. So I might say, I'm going to return those calls tomorrow or in an hour. I'm going to let my capacity come down. I might take a 10-minute meditation break and just bring my capacity down. I might need to have some silence, or I might need to listen to a little music. Just two songs could do that for me, could help bring capacity down, allow me to close up a little, and then I can open again. And I try to leave myself a little bit of time in the day now for opening and closing, because I realize that, I might start feeling very full. So I just want you to think of that act as opening and closing, and recognizing when you have too much, and see what you can do to just bring your capacity back down a little bit. Step 3 is listening and asking yourself if you have a solid, reliable listening post. It used to be very important that all of us in healthcare and human services and mental health care, that we had very reliable supervision and support, and we understood in the fields of mental health that you needed somebody that you could reliably have listened to what's going on as you're working with so many people that are struggling. And in fact, in China during the pandemic, and I'm not using them as a great example of mental health, but they did do something very interesting when they had counselors assigned in the cities where there was the biggest outbreak. They assigned somebody to check in with each mental health counselor each day to debrief by phone. Can you imagine? Each day, support, to just listen. Are you okay? How are you? What was going on? What was the hardest in the day for you? So I want you to ask yourself, do you have a support person, a mentor, or a supervisor that really is there for you? Or is your supervisor too overwhelmed to be present? And ask yourself how you're doing with this, because this is a really essential thing. I don't know if you've heard of Code Lavender. It's something that they now use in some healthcare settings. And what it is, how they have different codes in hospitals, but what this is a code for the healthcare worker where they could ask for some support because maybe something happened at home, or maybe something happened on their shift. And, Code Lavender people come with like a little basket of like hand lotion and, chewing gum and maybe a little Starbucks card, but they also come with a listener. That's the key part of Code Lavender, is they bring somebody that will just sit and listen. And so it's a very essential part of dealing with overwhelm. The next is to stop problem solving and reduce load. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to stop problem solving completely. It just means that you have to give your mind a little bit of a problem solving break, because when we're dealing with so many overwhelmed clients that we're caring for, they often are overloaded with problems and problem solving. And getting people to just stop and take a break from problem solving, closing, reducing the stress on the mind. And remember, some of those problems people are trying to solve have missing puzzle pieces, so they can't even actually solve them. And helping people to step back and see that you need to do the same with you. There are certain things that we have to be able to recognize. I can't solve that. And I also need to stop and give my mind a problem-solving break. And so just notice, because that brings a lot of stress on the body when we are problem solving and over problem solving. And so when you see yourself doing that, just be sure that you're recognizing your brain is a little worn out from that, and you're going to take a problem solving break. So I was in a workshop and somebody explained that their hobby was actually making puzzles. Like he was carving wooden puzzles and cutting them out using his tools. And he said, "Oh my gosh, this is why my self-care puzzle making doesn't help me now." And I said, "Right." I said, "How's that going?" And he said, "It's awful. I hate doing my favorite thing now," because it was bringing up more problems and he really didn't have space for it. So I want you to just recognize, I'm a knitter. So when I have been doing a lot of problem solving, I don't take out a complicated thing to knit. I do something very simple because I'm aware that my mind needs a rest, and so does yours. The next step is, okay, maybe you don't have a listener, but you can definitely have a journal. So create a container to share your feelings and share what you experience. My morning ritual is to write in my journal as soon as I get up, and it's like having a listener for me. And I'm very faithful to this. I do this before I even get up and go to the bathroom. And, sometimes it's a very short thing. Maybe I write 4 or 5 sentences, and sometimes, I might do a page, but it's not a very long process. It's like the first 10 minutes, 5 minutes. And I want you to think about what you can do for self-care on the job and off. It used to be, as people were starting to understand the needs of self-care, people were thinking of it as something you do on the weekend or something you do when you go home each day. Um, I want you to think of it as what you can do while you're on the job, what you do all through the day. How do you take care of yourself? And what are some ideas that you have that you can share? Hold this question, because we're having a discussion group in 2 weeks, and we're going to be discussing some of the ways that you're doing self-care on the job so that we can get into a richer dialogue about this. This is one of the things that we'll be coming back to. Since I'm doing a lot of Zoom work with people, I found that I really needed to do head and neck stretches, particularly because of my neck, while I'm online all the time. So I just really want to encourage you to be sure that you're taking head and neck stretches all the way through your work online. Now, overwhelm, I think of it like an octopus with lots of tentacles and lots of directions. And obviously, it's not just affecting you, it's affecting every system. It's affecting all leadership. And this has really been a test for us to see, how fragile and how vulnerable all those systems are, and how many expectations there are on these systems now, and how they have not been able to meet them. So you are surrounded by widespread overwhelm. And you're expected to bring your caring to the job every day. And we know that when you get overwhelmed, one of the things that starts to break into pieces is that feeling of caring, like there just isn't any room to carry anymore. And you're dealing with completely overwhelmed patients and clients inside of a context of an overwhelmed community, inside of a context with overwhelmed organizations and supervisors everywhere that you turn. So things that could have been resources are often not working very well. And the thing that I want us to be aware of is that some of us are also dealing with significant moral injuries. And moral injuries kind of break your spirit. And it makes people question your ability to do the right thing. And I know that we've been hearing in the news of some people that, particularly in the medical field, that felt so helpless, teachers that felt so powerless through this, that they and became so severely depressed, and they ended up taking their lives and feeling like they were powerless to offer anything. And so we often have thought of moral injuries as something that happens to people when they're in war, but it's also something that is happening now to many people in different professions. And so I want us to think of moral injuries as a feeling that you're causing harm to others without intending to, and that you feel helpless to save or help people. Sometimes you can't do anything or the resource doesn't exist. And it's also a moral injury is when there's a moral contract, an expectation that having something as simple as personal protective equipment and the failure of not getting that. A moral injury now is when employers are not prepared for a deadly pandemic, but they're expecting you, the essential worker, to show up and put you in harm's way without any protection. That's a moral injury. And so we have a lot of people now also being, and you included in that, being morally injured. And you are also caring and treating people who are carrying a lot of moral injuries. And we have to be able to understand that this is part of what is overwhelming people. And so with all of this, it's really essential to ask yourself, how are you tending to your grief? How are you stopping to feel your grief when you need to? Yesterday, I was in my car. I got my second vaccine, the second dose. Oh my God, I was so grateful. But I cried all the way home for all the people that aren't getting it right now. I want everyone to have it. I cried thinking about the devastating effect this has had on our country and on the world and on my little community. And so I had just lots of tears, and I realized I was just grieving, and I needed to just sit with it and just feel the grief and recognize all of the elements that were in those tears that were part of it. I had expected myself to be more like, yahoo, I got the second dose, but that wasn't what hit me at all. What hit me was grief. So I want you to pay attention to that, because you have to stop and feel the grief that you're carrying from what you're experiencing. You know, I don't call my work resiliency work. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but mostly because I've spent my entire career in healthcare and human service work. And I believe there's a lot of shame placed on us around having to be so resilient in front of the face of so much. You are human, you are not superhuman. And I think there's a lot of myths and madness around the topic of resiliency. And so I just want you to know that if what you've been feeling instead of resilient is very vulnerable, I think that makes a lot of sense. We're all vulnerable through this. And one of the things that I found really helpful in this particular time is the work of self-compassion. And I will be diving into that a little more in our series. But for now, I want you to know that every morning I put my hand over my heart and I say to myself, I don't know what you're going to see today. I don't know what you're going to hear today, but I've got you. I'm with you. And self-compassion is the work of acknowledging what you feel, those tears of grief that I had in the car, and just responding with kindness, not telling myself I'm broken and crazy, but just telling myself, yeah, I understand why you're crying, and it's okay. Go ahead, here's some more tissues. And then opening and closing as we need, realizing that I needed to make a little more space to hold some of my own grief and opening into that, and then closing as I need to. Next week, we are going to be focusing on working with others who are overwhelmed and specific strategies that help other people when they're overwhelmed, things you can say, things you can do. And we're also going to be working on your very specific self-care plan. And then the week after that, we're going to have a discussion group. So it won't just be me talking to you like this, but you will get to share back some of the key things and how you use them in your life and what's working for you and what you need. And we're going to dive into that. So I am also going to take questions for the next 15 minutes and do my best to offer you some more through questions. And boundaries is another area that we'll be getting into. And I do have weekly free boundary tips. They're like a sentence long, and you can sign up for them on my website. So, Jennifer, hi. Do we change?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and pull up my screen now. And
Great.
folks, yes, thank you so much, by the way, Sarah. This was great. I'm going to go ahead and encourage folks to plop some questions within either the chat or within our Q&A section. There's one that just popped up, Nutty, thank you. What role do you feel empathy and self-compassion have as an antidote to overwhelm?
I've been working with self-compassion for a while, and I actually think it's very important because it's something that people can do even before they do self-care. So self-compassion is kind of foundational to self-care. It isn't going to be the entire thing that relieves the overwhelm, right? Because there's other components that are necessary for relieving some of this overwhelm, but it is very important for being able to hold yourself and meeting your feelings. So self-compassion is really helpful for acknowledging what you feel. And that part about not abandoning yourself or ignoring the overwhelm, self-compassion is really key for that. So I think that it is an important tool in the tool chest that we have to learn how to do. And we're going to dive into that deeper as we go through the series. But I hope that answers it. It's not the whole thing for treating overwhelm, but it is a piece of it. And it's actually one of the easiest pieces to do. What's great about self-compassion is, like I gave you my morning ritual of just putting my hand on my heart and reminding myself I was going to see and hear hard things. And I didn't know what they were, but I would get me, I'd be with me in it and take care of me in it. Just that little reminder helps orient me to what might be coming in the day that's very unexpected. And that helps me to not feel so overwhelmed when those things do indeed happen. But we're going to dive deeper in that. Thank you for asking.
Excellent. And we have a few more. Sarah, you spoke about problem-solving breaks, and for doers, this can be a challenge. What do you recommend kind of for filling, for kind of taking that time to take that break, or if they're feeling kind of threatened about taking a break, how do you help people jump in and actually take problem-solving breaks?
can I be honest and tell you that is a very difficult thing to get people to do? Like in my practice, when I work with people, telling them they must take a problem solving break is where I see the most resistance. And at the same time, holding firm in knowing that if they don't, they're just crashing over and over again. They're just literally banging their heads into the wall. And helping them to recognize that I know they want to feel better becomes a real selling point. And I'm honest with people about they've been in this a long time and the continuous problem solving doesn't help. It's the refresh, the reset, allowing the mind to rest. It recovers and it's almost like you get a reboot. You get a better problem solving brain and we get a little perspective like, ooh, that's a problem I actually can't solve. And we need both. So sometimes doing that with somebody helps. When I sit with clients and I see them over problem solving into things that can't be solved, I have to dive in and help point that out and say, this isn't solvable. It's not that you're not trying, it's that you're not in control of that. And so helping people to see that and then say, what would happen if you let go, and face some of that powerlessness, then we get into the work, right? And honestly, I think this is connected a little bit to that sense of resiliency that we're all kind of expected as providers. You're expected to be very resilient, but really, you need breaks from this too, from this problem solving to be able to step back and allow your mind to rest. So I recognize it when I start making mistakes or I can't finish something and I notice I'm going very slowly through it, like I'm struggling. And rather than continuing to struggle, I just say to myself, I think my brain is worn down and I need to stop problem solving and I need to move away and come back to it when I'm fresh. And I know that things go a lot faster when I'm fresh.
That's great. And another question that popped up just as you were speaking about this is there a physical practice to stop the problem solving, like rubbing your hands together or doing something like that? So I wanted to put that question out there.
Yeah, so I often walk, literally walking away is the physical part for me to stop problem solving is I let myself walk. And that kind of movement, I'll even walk in the house, but walking outside, no matter the weather, just that walking, that act of walking, whether it's slow walking or fast walking, I'm grounding myself back in my body and I'm getting myself out of my mind. And I'm letting go. And I say to myself over and over, like, let go. And I get an image, I visualize an image of a very hot stove and putting your hand on it and letting myself know that's too hot right now. Get your hand off that.
That's excellent. I've got a few more questions that have come in too, Sari. This is from Jay. Can you say more about opening and closing? What does that look like as you go through the day?
So opening and closing is acknowledging, and for you, Jay, it may end up looking a little different. So I want to acknowledge that. I want between now and when we get to discussion group, if you're able to join for that, I really want you to practice that in between and see what it becomes for you. So it can look different for different people, but opening and closing is recognizing I'm open. I have capacity and ability to hear more, to take another phone call, to have a conversation, and recognizing that I might be full and I might need to close. And I mean, close myself emotionally or close myself to taking in more. So I come home and literally my husband, was sharing this big problem that he was having with our electrical panel. Well, this was after I was called by a sheriff's office to a place where somebody had shot themselves in the woods. So I come home from that and my husband is talking about the electrical panel and the problems. And I was like, I can't really do electrical panel tonight. I can't actually do more problems tonight. I need to close. I can't take in more. And I step back, and then he gets it and reframes. And I say, can we talk about something else? Like just anything but that. Um, and it's being able to not take in more, to see where you need to shut down, even if you need to call in and take a mental health day, because you actually can't take in more, and recognizing when you can't. We don't give ourselves a lot of permission in our field to cancel or to postpone by a week, but sometimes we need to close. I don't often need to do that. I can close by turning on music, and I play music that has no words. And it's kind of like that meditative massage type of music. And for some reason, that does a lot for my brain and it helps me close. I'm not taking in any memories. I don't have any association with these songs. I'm not listening to somebody else's words. But I turn this on literally for 4 minutes between clients. And it makes a big difference for me. It just allows me to close. But I want you to discover what allows you to close and where you're allowing yourself not to take in more when you can't.
So we have a couple more. I think we might be able to squeeze them in. From Kurt, he says there seems to be a lot of like macho-ness in hospice workers. We are the few, the proud, the strong that others can rely on. How do you think we can invite them to be more human?
Right? Oh my gosh. I love this question because I've been working on recovery for someone who has been a hospice worker for 40 years. And it's taken them a long time to recognize that they're feeling a lot of grief. They actually couldn't see it, which I know might sound counterintuitive to all of you listening, but that's the reality of hospice work is you see so much death every day and so much loss. And that part about you're invincible, you can't, you're the strong one that everyone leans on. Well, welcome to healthcare and human services. That's been the myth that we've all been told, is that that's what we're supposed to do. That's what we get hired to do. And so now to be able to bring up to people, just doing what you said, just pointing out, you're vulnerable. You have needs too. What do you do when you don't feel strong? What do you do when you're tired? What do you do when your heart hurts after you've driven away from a family that you know is suffering? Can you visualize your heart? It helps sometimes to ask what image they see when you say that. So I think there is more room for us, Kurt, to talk about vulnerability and recognizing our vulnerability than using the word resiliency. But we're fighting against years and years, decades really, of throwing that word into this field and having workshops where people are taught to be even more resilient, and self-care is used as some kind of thing, a shield to everything, and it isn't. And the more people in the field that are honest about that and start sharing your own vulnerability too, that can help workers around you. I know that when we get to talking about secondary trauma, I wrote an article about my own experience with secondary trauma, and it was used at Kaiser when they were training their medical staff in Overwhelm, and people were blown away that I could talk about my own experience of secondary trauma and still feel okay with myself, not carry all that shame. So it's, I think, something that leaders have to bring into the field. And I think we have to be more open to that. And the more of us that talk about vulnerability and that being okay, and that's part of being in this field because you're human, I think keep being the messenger.
Thank you, Sarah. I think we have time for one more here. Christine asks, do you have a recommendation for a self-assessment tool that might help to figure out where you're at with overwhelm and or compassion fatigue?
So, as we go along in our next session, we're going to do more on self care, and and we're going to look at those things. There's, so many people are feeling compassion fatigue and exhaustion, and I have a feeling that you know what you're feeling, and I have a feeling that you have a sense of what those symptoms are for you. But we're going to look at self care more deeply, and you'll be able to assess through that. Are you offering yourself these things, and which areas do you feel like you're not, and maybe you need? And you'll be able to hear kind of where you feel most called to support yourself with more self care or a different kind of self care. I think during the pandemic, there's been a need for very different kinds of self care for those of us that work in mental health, healthcare, and human services. And we're going to look at that. But I don't have a test I can refer you to, but there might be people in the chat who have and use those kinds of things. I tend not to use those kinds of things. And as we go along, I'll explain why. But I want you to use your inner sense, your inner knowing of you. And just that you're asking that question and using those words tells me you have a sense that you're concerned for you. And that's okay. We're going to work on how to support yourself in those feelings, okay?
All right, thank you, Sari. We have a few more questions that are in the queue, and I believe what we'll be able to do then is circle back with them in our kind of our next sessions that you do as well, because we are getting close on time, and we want to honor your time here today. We really appreciate, actually, the engagement is fantastic. This has been an amazing group of folks. We have had folks actually from all over the world that are on the call today. So I just wanted to say thank you. England and London is fantastic. You'll see on your screen, know that Sari again will be with us then for again the course of this next 6 weeks. Every Friday, it will be at 11 o'clock Central Time. We'll put in the chat box again then the list of Eventbrite registration spots where you can go and register for these, which would be wonderful. So know that we'll put that in the chat. You'll also, when we get done with today's training too, within the next day, I'll be sure to send you out an email with this information as well too. So you'll get that either this afternoon or on Monday, so it'll come your way. We would love though to have you to continue to join us at these upcoming sessions. Again, the next one again is going to be next Friday, and that's working with then others who are working with others who are overwhelmed.